Good morning, dear third year students. Together we will begin the lectures of motor nervous system. Motor function of the spinal cord. What is the reflex arc? Together we will start with the reflex arc. It is a basic unit of the integrated neuronal activity. The activity of our nervous system is dependent mainly on its basic unit, which is the reflex arc. What are the components of this reflex arc? It starts by receptor. The receptors that receive the sensation, that receive change in the environment, which we call stimulus, affect the receptor or sensed by receptor. This receptor sending its the nerve impulse in the afferent or the electrical current in the afferent, and then which is the sensory neuron. The afferent in the in the center area, whether in the spinal cord, in the brain stem, in the cortex, whatever, but it will end in the CNS itself or the center. After the center, in the center, there is interpretation of this sensory information in order to form the appropriate response that will be carried on the motor neuron, which is the efferent, to the effector organ to give the response. What is the motor function of the spinal cord? You have to know that the simplest form of movements that we call reflexes or spinal reflexes are controlled by the spinal cord. But the more complicated movement or more complex movements are controlled by our brain stem. Our brain stem composed of midbrain, pons, and medulla, and then continue as the spinal cord. So the simplest form of motor activities are controlled by the spinal cord, and the more complex movements are controlled by midbrain, pons, medulla, or what we call brain stem. And the highest or the most complex movements are controlled by the highest center of the nervous system, which is the cerebral cortex. Okay? What about the spinal reflexes? Actually, we have two types of spinal reflexes. One we call monosynaptic and the other polysynaptic. What do we mean? Monosynaptic reflex means, as we mentioned before, there is receptor, afferent, center, efferent, and effector organ, as we mentioned before. So, when there is a direct contact between afferent and efferent, this contact between two neurons, which are the afferent and efferent, is called synapse. Synapse is a junction between two neurons. When there is direct contact or direct junction between afferent and efferent, so one synapse between them, we call mono. Mono means one. Monosynaptic reflex. But when even one interneuron, another neuron, is between afferent and efferent, so we will find two synapses. Here, afferent with the interneuron, and here, efferent with the interneuron. So if only one interneuron is between the afferent and the efferent, here we have the polysynaptic reflexes. More than one is poly. Poly means multiple. More than one is polysynaptic reflex because we have one synapse here and one synapse here. But here we have only one synapse, so we called it monosynaptic, but here is polysynaptic reflex. Okay? The only monosynaptic reflex in our body is the stretch reflex. The stretch reflex, which will be the main topic of our lecture today. Stretch reflex, it myostatic reflex. Myostatic reflex. Myo means muscle. Myostatic reflex. It is the fastest reflex in our body. Why? Because it's the only monosynaptic reflex. There is no synaptic delay. There is no much synaptic delay, much time to be spent while crossing many synapses. No, it's only one synapse. So we will take a very short time to cross or to pass from the afferent to efferent, one synapse only, no time to spend. Okay? Synaptic delay is very short time because it's only monosynaptic reflex, so that's the fastest reflex in our body. What is the stretch reflex? What is the stimulus of stretch reflex? When we tap in the tendon of the muscle, or when we hit the muscle, the tendon of the muscle, or we stretching the muscle, tapping of its tendon make the muscle stretched, elongated. Okay? When we stretch the muscle, it sends along its receptor, which we call stretch reflex receptor. We will explain it in details. We'll send in the afferent, as we said, in the components of reflex arc, and the monosynapse in the center here in the spinal cord, and efferent to the same muscle so that the muscle respond reflexly by contraction. So the stretch reflex, when moderate stretch of the muscle occur, it will result in reflex contraction. Stretching, elongation of the muscle will be reacted by against by the muscle by contraction. When you stretch the muscle react by contraction. That's what we call stretch or myostatic reflex. Okay? What about the receptor of the stretch reflex? It's called muscle spindle because it's like spindle, it's spindle shape, so we called it muscle spindle. What is the stretch receptor? What's the stretch reflex receptor, or what is this muscle spindle? Muscle spindle, actually, we call it intrafusal muscle fibers. It's inside the muscle, dipped inside the muscle. Those are the extrafusal. Those red fibers are extrafusal muscle fibers, which are the normal muscle fibers that contract. But inside or within the extrafusal muscle fibers, there is another part called muscle spindle. Each spindle contain about from 8 to 9 intrafusal muscle fibers, orange in color, as you see. The intrafusal muscle fiber, or the muscle spindle, or the receptor of stretch reflex, contains two parts, or composed of two parts. Central part, which is receptor part, sensing part, and the peripheral part, which is contractile, has the ability to contract. So the central part only sense, only receptor part, only receive. So it send sensory afferent, it send sensory neuron to carry the sensation away from it. But the peripheral part has the ability to contract. It is like the muscle fibers. So the extrafusal muscle fibers has the ability to contract. So it receives, not send, it receives motor fibers to make it contract. Okay? So this is the muscle spindle. Central receptor part and peripheral contractile part. Okay? The intrafusal muscle fibers receive afferent sensory fibers, as we mentioned in the previous slide, and efferent motor fibers. Okay? What are the afferent? Let's start by afferent, the sensory fibers that received by the intrafusal muscle fibers. First, I will explain two types. We have two types of intrafusal muscle fibers or muscle spindles. According to their shape, someone is called nuclear, or some of them is called nuclear bag fiber, and the other is nuclear chain. Both of them are muscle spindles, two types of muscle spindle or stretch reflex receptor. One is called the nuclear bag and the other is nuclear chain. Why we call nuclear bag? Because it is aggregation of cells or aggregation of nuclei in a central dilated part like a bag. So its shape is like a bag. So that's why we called it nuclear bag. The other is arranged but like chain. Can you imagine the chain? Like chain. It's not bag, not dilated part in the center. No. Only arranged like a chain. So we called it nuclear chain. By their shape, called nuclear chain. Two types of muscle spindles, nuclear bag and nuclear chain. The primary afferent fibers, or the afferent fibers, they receive either primary or secondary. Either primary or secondary. The primary, the green fibers, they are sensory fibers, afferent fibers, okay? The primary afferent fibers called 1A, type of nerve fiber called 1A, okay? Ending on both, ending on the central part, which is the receptor part, okay? The sensory or the afferent fibers ending in the central part because it is the receptor part actually, to carry the sensation from it. The primary afferent fibers end on both nuclear bag and the nuclear chain. ending on both nuclear bag and the nuclear chain. This is the first type of the afferents, the afferent fibers, or we call primary afferent or 1A afferent fibers. The other is secondary afferent fibers, sensory fibers called secondary afferent fibers or type 2 nerve fibers, end only on nuclear chain, not on nuclear bag. So the primary afferent fibers or 1A ending on both nuclear bag and nuclear chain, but the secondary afferent fibers type 2 end only on nuclear chain. Okay? What are the differences or the main characteristics of primary and secondary? Primary, as we mentioned, end on both nuclear bag and nuclear chain, and it's shaped like a annulo spiral shape. But the secondary end only on nuclear chain, and it's flower spray endings, like flower spray. The primary index or group 1A, thick myelinated fibers, about 16 micron. But this type, myelinated, 2 fibers, half thickness, 8 microns only. This type is rapidly adapting. Rapidly adapting. What we mean by adaptation, as we mentioned before in the sensory part of the CNS, adaptation means the discharge, stop from the receptor despite the continuation of the stimulation, despite the continuation or the maintenance of the stimulus, but the discharge decrease or even disappear from the receptor. So the rapidly adapting, the primary endings are rapidly adapting because they are response of dynamic response. They charge only when the stretching of the muscle is occurring, but they adapt rapidly. So when the stretch is maintained, they stop discharging. So the stimulus is still present, but the response is off because they are rapidly adapting. They stop discharging despite the presence of the stimulus, which is stretching of or elongation of the muscle. That we call dynamic response. It discharges only to inform the body about it's a time of stretching happening now. But the other is slowly adapting, the secondary ending, slowly, or we call tonic fibers. What do we mean by slowly adapting? We slowly adapting fibers or slowly adapting receptors means responsible of static response. So they can maintain discharging or continue discharging when the stretch is maintained, when the stretch is continuous, when the stretch is sustained. They continue discharging. Okay, that's the main difference between the nuclear bag and nuclear chain, or the primary and secondary endings. Again, the primary fiber, the afferent fibers are primary, ending on both nuclear bag and nuclear chain, but secondary ending only on nuclear chain. Efferent fibers, which are motor, that supply the peripheral contractile part. Why? Because they are motor, not sensory, receiving from the receptor central part. No. The efferent fibers, motor fibers, which we call gamma efferent motor fibers, and they are 4 micron thickness, they end on the peripheral contractile part. This is the gamma efferent motor fibers, ending on either, they are two types, either dynamic gamma efferent, so end on the receptor which is responsible for the dynamic response. Which one? Yes, nuclear bag. And static gamma efferents end on nuclear chain, because nuclear chain is responsible for static response. So gamma efferent either dynamic or static. Dynamic ending on nuclear bag mainly, and static ending on nuclear chain mainly. And trail endings like trail, and the plate endings just is shaped like trail or plate, so we called it as its shape. What is the central connection of afferent fibers? When the afferent fibers are rising, either primary or secondary, arising from the muscle spindle, where should they go? They go, or they pass in 3 pathways, in 3 routes. The first is the main route or the main pathway of the stretch reflex, entering in the posterior horn cells. And here what we call dorsal root or posterior root ganglion, in the posterior root or the posterior horn cells, which are sensory, and then make junction or synapse with this what we call alpha motor neuron. It is the anterior horn cell present in the anterior horn cells. As we mentioned before, the anterior horn cells are always motor. The posterior horn cells are always sensory. So this is the normal reflex arc. Muscle spindle, afferent fibers, either primary or secondary, posterior horn cells, then synapse with anterior horn cells, which is alpha motor neuron. Its type is alpha motor neuron, sending alpha motor fibers to extrafusal muscle fibers of the same muscle to make contraction. This is the normal stretch reflex, stretching leading to contraction. It's okay. What is the second pathway? The afferent fibers may cross with the dorsal column pathway. Return back to the sensory pathways. You will remember what we mentioned about the dorsal column, carrying the position sense. So it crosses with the position sense fibers to reach the cerebral cortex, is a somatic sensory area of the cortex, as one of proprioceptive sensations or position sense, to inform the brain about the length of the muscle, the rate of change of its length, the condition of the muscle, because the brain must be informed all the time about your muscle and your joints and your skeleton and the position of your different parts of your body. The brain must be informed to be ready for any movement, any future movement, to be ready. So the brain must be informed all the time. So how can we inform the brain? The primary afferents cross with the dorsal column pathway to the cerebral cortex, somatic sensory area, to which receives the proprioceptive sensation or the position sense. What is the third pathway? The primary afferent fibers may cross in the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tract. Spinocerebellar tract ends in another part called cerebellum, which is a small brain. Cerebellum is responsible of what we call coordination and organization of motor activity or movements. Okay, so three parts or three pathways can the primary afferents or the secondary afferents of the stretch reflex or the afferent fibers of nuclear bag or nuclear chain can end either to complete the reflex arc or to ascend in the dorsal column pathway to the cortex to inform the brain about the position of the muscle or length and rate of change in it of the muscle, or ending in cerebellum via spinocerebellar tracts, ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar tract, in order to perform, the cerebellum can perform what we call coordination of motor activity. Okay. What are the functions of gamma efferents, the motor fibers that supply the peripheral contractile part of the muscle spindle or the nuclear bag or nuclear chain? They produce what we call reflex muscle contraction, or gamma loop. What we mean by that? First of all, we have here the skeletal muscle, normal skeletal muscle. Here is the muscle spindle we mentioned before. There is a central receptor part and the afferent coming out from it, A alpha fibers, primary afferents here. So, and there is a peripheral contractile part which are supplied by gamma efferent as we mentioned before. Okay? Then, when the gamma efferent are stimulated, what we mean by gamma efferents? Gamma efferents, the blue fibers here. Gamma efferents, when stimulated, they lead to contraction to the peripheral contractile part which they supply. They supply the peripheral contractile part of the muscle spindle, which have the capability, the ability or the capability of contraction. So when gamma efferents discharge increase or gamma efferents stimulated, they produce contraction of the peripheral contractile part of the intrafusal fibers. That leads to stretching of the central receptor part. When these parts contract, this will make elongation or stretching of the central receptor part. Okay, so the stretch reflex will be stimulated, as when this part is stimulated or stretched, will send along its afferent fibers, which are one A fibers. So it will send this to the alpha motor neurons of the cortex, of the spinal cord, anterior horn cells, will send along the alpha motor fibers to the extrafusal muscle fibers of the same muscle and contraction. Okay. As if so, in the previous slide, we mentioned how gamma efferent or how gamma loop occurs. What is the other function of the gamma loop or the gamma efference? Alpha gamma linkage. What is the alpha gamma linkage? Let us imagine when alpha efferent are stimulated. Alpha efferent, alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord, when stimulated, it sends impulses along the alpha motor fibers that supply the extrafusal muscle fibers, so the muscle contract. It is the normal active contraction we know about the muscle. Okay, the cortex send impulses to the alpha motor neurons, and the alpha fibers are stimulated, so the muscle contract. When the muscle contract, it shorten. When the muscle contract, it shorten. Its length is less than normal. So, what do you expect will happen in the muscle spindle? Oh, there is no stretching. There is no stretching at all. So, the muscle spindle will be inhibited because the muscle spindle only stimulated by stretching. When the muscle is stretched, but here the muscle is contracting, is shortening. Its length is less than its normal length. So, no stretching will occur in the muscle spindle, so there is inhibition of muscle spindle. Oh, so there will no stretch reflex, and the brain will not be informed about the length of the muscle, about the position of the muscle. It's a big problem. So, how we can solve this problem? We can solve this problem when we link alpha and gamma together. How? When we link alpha to alpha, it will cause or produce muscle contraction, as we mentioned before. No problem. So, but at the same time, you have to increase the gamma efferent discharge. Oh, remember the previous slide? When we increase the gamma efferent discharge, that means the peripheral contractile part of the muscle spindle will contract. So the central receptor part will be stretched. On the contrary of here there is no stretching, but here there is a stretch because we increase the gamma efferent discharge. We stimulated gamma fibers. So there is contraction of the peripheral part of the muscle spindle, leading to stretching of the central part. So it will send the impulses along its afferent, either primary or secondary afferents, to the spinal cord, returning back into alpha motor fibers to the same fibers or to the extrafusal fibers of the same muscle, leading to its contraction. So the muscle, the stretch reflex or the muscle tone will be continued, what we mean by muscle tone or muscle contraction. It is another type of stretch reflex, as we will mention. Another type of stretch reflex, which is maintain the muscle contraction to prevent the unloading. What is the unloading? Unloading means the brain will not be informed about the state of the muscle. So, because there is inhibition of muscle spindle in the first state, or in the first case. But here, the muscle spindle will not be inhibited anymore. It will be stimulated because we link it together, alpha stimulation and gamma stimulation. That will lead to alpha-gamma linkage, that will lead to maintenance of muscle tone to prevent the unloading, so the cortex or the brain will continue receiving information about shortening of the muscle, and the muscle, as a stretch reflex, will not be inhibited anymore. So, when the muscle spindles are stimulated, when muscle is stretched, as we mentioned in the previously, when muscle is stretched, there is a stretching occurring in the, or elongated, there is a stretching or elongation occurring in the muscle spindle, leading to the normal stretch reflex, as we mentioned before. When else? When the muscle contract, what do you expect? No, when the muscle contract, it's shortening. So no stimulation. When alpha only is stimulated, there is no stimulation of muscle stretch receptor. So there is no stimulation of the muscle spindle. So when the muscle actively contracted or only alpha are activated, there is no stimulation of muscle spindle. Okay. But when muscle contract, when we activate both alpha and gamma, the muscle will contract and the gamma efferent discharge will increase, as we mentioned in the previous slide. So the stretch reflex will occur as the muscle spindle will be stimulated. So only in two cases, when the muscle are stretched or when both alpha and gamma are stimulated, muscle contracted and increased gamma efferent discharge. In these both cases, only muscle spindles will be stimulated. Otherwise, when the muscle contracting with no stimulation or increase of gamma efferent discharge, no stimulation of muscle spindle and the stretch reflex will be inhibited. Here we can clarify something about why nuclear bag is responsible for dynamic response, as we mentioned in the table before, and why nuclear chain is responsible for static. Actually, there is what we call viscoelastic difference between both of them, nuclear bag and nuclear chain. Viscoelastic difference. The nuclear bag have elastic characteristic, can rebound, can return back after initial elongation or stretching, can returning back to its initial length. That's why they are rapidly adapting. They stop discharging after short time of stretching. Once stretching is not occurring, or the action of stretching is not occurring, even if maintained, but they stop discharging because they can returning back, they can rebound by its elastic characteristic after initial elongation, so they are responsible for the dynamic response. On the contrary, the nuclear chain have no elastic characteristic, no elastic rebound, so on stimulation or maintained stimulation, they are stretched all the time, so continue discharging all the time, so they are they can respond to static or responsible for static response of the muscle stretching. What are types of cells in the anterior horn cells? We have three types of cells actually. We talked about alpha motor neuron here, alpha motor neuron, which send alpha motor fibers to extrafusal muscle fibers. We have gamma motor neuron, which send gamma efferent discharge or gamma efferent to supply the peripheral contractile part of muscle spindle or intrafusal muscle fibers. We have also third type of Renshaw cells that are inhibitory interneurons responsible for something called lateral inhibition and sharpening of motor activity. So we have three types, alpha and gamma motor neurons and Renshaw cells inhibitory interneurons. What is the size principle? We have two types of alpha fibers, either small alpha fibers or large alpha fibers. Small alpha fibers, nerve fibers, supply the slow muscle fibers, but large alpha fibers supply fast, easily fatigued muscle fibers, which are responsible for the fast movement and easily fatigued. Alpha fibers are more excitable than small alpha fibers are more excitable than large alpha fibers. So when we have low cortical impulses, when we have low impulses or low electrical current coming from the cortex, the more excitable small alpha will be excited, leading to small force because small alpha fibers will be stimulated, leading to contraction of slow muscle fibers, leading to small force. But when more cerebral cortical impulses are received, the less excitable large alpha fibers will be excited, leading to contraction of the fast fatigued muscle fibers and large force will be obtained. What are the types of stretch reflex? The types of stretch reflex actually are two types, static stretch reflex and dynamic stretch reflex. The static stretch reflex are the what are the fibers responsible of the receptors are the nuclear chain, and primary and secondary endings that end in nuclear chain are responsible for this static stretch reflex. Constant stretching leading to static constant contraction of the muscle, because the nuclear chain maintain its discharge because they are slowly adapting, as we mentioned before. So it is the basis of what we call muscle tone. because our muscles, even if not actively contracting, even during sleep, our muscles are stretched all the time because of its length is always shorter than the distance between origin and insertion. And also by the effect of gravity, so our muscles are under stretching condition all the time. So the muscle maintains the static stretch reflex all the time, even when we are sleeping, but muscle tone decrease when we are sleeping, but still present. So there is a degree of contraction present all the time in our muscles called muscle tone. Dynamic stretch reflex is when we suddenly stretch the muscle, there will be sudden contraction followed by rapid relaxation. Which one is responsible is the nuclear bag. Primary endings only end in nuclear bag because nuclear bag is rapidly adapting. Discharge only when the stretch is occurring, is happening, is taking place. But if we maintain the stretch, there will not be discharging anymore because they are rapidly adapting. So they are responsible of dynamic stretch reflex, which is the basis of tendon jerk or deep reflex that I think you already saw a lot of examples or multiple examples of dynamic or tendon jerk or deep reflexes in the practical section. What is the negative stretch reflex? The negative stretch reflex, passive shortening of the muscle. Passive shortening of the muscle. Here the muscle is shortened passively, not by active contraction. Passive shortening of the muscle will inhibit, because the muscle is shortened, so will inhibit the muscle spindle, no discharge from the muscle spindle, so the muscle will be relaxed. It's the contrary, it is the negative part or the negative aspect of stretch reflex. The stretch reflex, when you stretch or elongate the muscle, it will respond by contraction. Here is the contrary. When you shorten the muscle will respond by relaxation. So, when you shorten the muscle or the muscle is less than its initial length, will be relaxed to return to its initial length. And when muscle is stretched more than its initial length, will be contract to return to its initial length. So, the stretch reflex always responsible for maintaining constant length of the muscle. Okay, either stretch reflex or negative stretch reflex, both of them are responsible for maintaining constant length of the muscle. The stretch reflex is a spinal monosynaptic or myostatic reflex, but have higher centers that control it. Supraspinal centers or supraspinal controlling or regulating centers of the stretch reflex that may facilitate or stimulate or may inhibit. So we have about 4 facilitatory areas higher than the level of the spinal cord, and 5 inhibitory areas. What are the excitatory or facilitatory or stimulatory, and what are the inhibitory areas? Let's see. The first facilitatory area in the cortex is motor area 4, which is the pyramidal area or the main area responsible for the motor action in our body. Motor area 4, which is in the precentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex. Motor area 4 is facilitatory, is stimulatory to stretch reflex, increase the stretch reflex. Another area called NEUII326. It's part of the cerebellum. Cerebellum means a small brain, present just behind the brain stem. And there is also a part in the brain stem called pontine reticular formation in the pons, which is facilitatory reticular formation to the stretch reflex. And the fourth area is the vestibular nucleus in the medulla, and it is facilitatory. So we have 4 areas. The motor area 4 of the cerebral cortex, the facilitatory reticular formation in the pons of the brain stem, the neocerebellum, which is part of the cerebellum, and vestibular nucleus in the medulla. What about the inhibitory areas? Another area in the cortex, but called suppressor area. It's a small strip in front of the cortical motor area, small strip, called area 4S, not area 4. 4S means suppressor. Suppressor means inhibitory, means inhibition. So it's an inhibitory center to the cerebral cortex. The other area is the paliocerebellum. Here we mentioned neurocerebellum is facilitatory, but paliocerebellum is another part of the cerebellum, but it is inhibitory. Okay, what else? We have only here inhibitory reticular formation in the medulla. The facilitatory here was in the pons, pontine reticular formation, but inhibitory is in medulla. Okay? We have another two areas. Area called basal ganglia, lenticular or lentiform nucleus, basal ganglia. We will have a lecture about basal ganglia, but later on, maybe fourth or fifth lecture. And area called red nucleus in the brain, in the midbrain. So we have 5 areas which are inhibitory or suppressor to the stretch reflex. Cortical suppressor area for S, the basal ganglia, the red nucleus in the midbrain, the paliocerebellum part of the cerebellum, and the medullary reticular formation or the inhibitory reticular formation. The facilitatory centers send their impulses through the facilitatory reticular formation. Let's revise again. The motor area 4, the neurocerebellum, the vestibular nucleus, and the pontine reticular formation, they are the facilitatory areas. But the other 3 areas, either motor area 4, neurocerebellum, or vestibular nucleus, send their impulses to stimulate the stretch reflex, send their impulses to the cord to stimulate stretch reflex along what we call ventral reticulospinal tract. But at the same time, they send their impulses along the pontine reticular formation or through the pontine reticular formation. So pontine reticular formation collect the facilitatory impulses from the motor area 4, from the neurocerebellum, from the vestibular nucleus, and then sending back along ventral reticulospinal tract to increase the gamma efferent discharge and increase the stretch reflex. But at the same time, you have something we have to mention, that even if the pontine reticular formation it didn't receive any facilitatory impulses from motor area 4 or neurocerebellum or vestibular nucleus, it still can send stimulatory impulses to the spinal cord to stimulate stretch reflex, because it has what we call its own activity, its all intrinsic activity. So even if not stimulated or not receiving the stimulatory impulses from the other stimulatory areas, motor area 4 or neurocerebellum or vestibular nucleus, it still has the capability or the ability to send facilitatory impulses to stimulate the stretch reflex. Okay? Something else about the vestibular nucleus, it can send along the pontine reticular formation or by its own can send directly through what we call vestibulospinal tract directly to the spinal cord to affect the stretch reflex or to increase the stretch reflex. Okay? The inhibitory centers, let's revise. The inhibitory centers were suppressor area for S, the basal ganglia, the red nucleus, the paleo, not neurocerebellum here, the paliocerebellum, and the inhibitory reticular formation. Okay? All inhibitory centers send their impulses through the inhibitory reticular formation here, which is the medullary reticular formation. Then along what we call not ventral, lateral reticulospinal. Okay? Lateral reticulospinal. But the inhibitory reticular formation, on the contrary of the facilitatory reticular formation in the bones, the inhibitory reticular formation here in the medulla has no own intrinsic activity, So if not receiving impulses from other areas, it will not be able to send inhibitory impulses to inhibit the stretch reflex. Okay? The red nucleus can send also directly to the spinal cord to inhibit stretch reflex by what we call roprospinal. Ropro means red because it's coming from the red nucleus to the spinal cord, roprospinal tract. Facilitation and inhibition or inhibitory fibers do not affect the alpha. They affect only gamma because they send either their facilitatory or inhibitory impulses along or to gamma motor neurons. But the only area that can affect directly the alpha motor neuron are the vestibular nucleus in the medulla. Let's make an experiment or do an experiment. They brought an experimental animal, let's say cat, and then they cause transection or cutting in the brainstem between the midbrain and pons, between the superior and inferior colliculi or the midbrain and pons. So all areas above the bones are now separated from the spinal cord. We cut, we transect horizontally the midbrain from the bone. So the pons or of the brainstem. So all areas above the pons are now out of service, cannot send their impulses due to this transection to the spinal cord. What will happen in the stretch reflex? What will happen? This section or transection will remove the inhibitory effect or the supraspinal centers, leaving only the strong facilitatory centers to affect the stretch reflex. How? Don't forget that we make the section here between midbrain and pons, but the pons have strong facilitatory center called facilitatory reticular formation, and it has its own intrinsic activity, can send by its own even if not receiving impulses from the other centers that we removed by cutting, either from the neocerebellum or from the motor area 4 or whatever. We cut, we remove the effect of motor area 4, the facilitatory effect, or the neocerebellum, but at the same time we kept the facilitatory reticular formation is still working, it still has its own intrinsic activity, so can send to facilitate the stretch reflex. Also, we have in the medulla below, we have also the vestibular nucleus, and can send by its own, also can send its own discharge. So the strong facilitatory effect is still present. The strong facilitatory centers are still working, even if we made this transection, but the strong facilitatory impulse is still reaching to the spinal cord, stimulating the gamma motor neuron, so the tone increased. So when we see this animal, we will see by decerebrate rigidity or by transection, the animal will be like that. Highly arched back, extended forelimbs and hind limbs, and elevated tails, because the muscle tone increased. The muscle tone, which is a static response of the stretch reflex, as we mentioned, will be increased. When increasing muscle tone, that will lead to in the anti-gravity muscles. And the anti-gravity muscles will leading to arching back, extended limbs, and elevated tails, as we see, because they are the anti-gravity muscle. What if a similar lesion occur in the human, but not experimentally? It will happen by lesion in the internal capsule, either hemorrhage or thrombus or whatever, any traumatic lesion in the internal capsule that carrying the motor fibers and sensory fibers through it. Internal capsule is a pathway or passage for both motor and sensory fibers to cross. Lesion in internal capsule in human will make the same effect, because it will inhibit abolish or remove the effect of the inhibitory centers, so the stimulatory centers will be only the effective ones, so will increase the stimulatory impulses to the gamma motor neurons, and then will increase the muscle tone, and this will be disappearing by cutting the posterior root and cutting the reflex arc of stretch reflex. What is the clinical importance of stretch reflex? What is the clinical importance of stretch reflex? The clinical importance is, number one, is it's responsible for what we call muscle tone. The static stretch reflex or the static response is muscle tone. What is a muscle tone? It's a degree of contraction present all the time in our muscles, especially in the anti-gravity muscles, because they resist the effect of gravity, so they are stretched all the time by the effect of gravity, so the muscle tone is more. And thank God they are more in the anti-gravity muscle. What are the anti-gravity muscle? They are elevators of the jaw, flexors of upper limbs, extensors of the neck, extensors of the trunk and lower limbs. Okay? Lower limb flexors, upper limb flexors, lower limb trunk and neck extensors, and elevators of the jaw. Why we say that thank God that the muscle tone increasing mainly in the anti-gravity muscle, because they maintain the body position or body posture against the effective gravity, otherwise we will fall down. Number two, squeezing of the muscle, contraction of the muscle, as you see, or muscle tone, leading to squeezing of the deep veins, leading to helping venous return. The blood coming back to the heart in order to be pumped again and not to be regurgitated and retained in the veins. Okay? The third function of the muscle tone is to keep viscera in position. To keep viscera in position. Can you imagine if there is no tone in the abdominal muscle? So the viscera will come out of the abdomen. But thank God this will not happen because of the strong muscle tone in the abdominal muscles. What is the other importance of stretch reflex? What we call tendon jerk or deep reflex. I think you already studied them and saw them demonstrated in front of you in the practical section. So, sudden striking of the tendon, leading to sudden stretching of the muscle by the hammer, leading to stimulation of the dynamic part of stretch reflex or dynamic aspect, leading to stretch contraction of the muscle. So the biceps tendon, quadriceps tendon will be just below the patella, will be tabbed or striked here, leading to stimulation of muscle spindle in the quadriceps muscle, and will send to the spinal cord, so that will send motor fibers to the extrafusal muscle fibers contraction and extension of the knee, as you see, and the lower limb or the leg will be shifted, as you see here. Will be extension of the lower limb, as you see, by contraction of quadriceps muscle. How can you facilitate, how can you increase the stretch reflex? By putting the muscle in semi-stretched position before you starting the stretch reflex, as you see in the practical section, and increasing gamma efferent discharge by what we call Jandrasic maneuver, either by clenching of teeth or tightening your fingers together, as you see here. Types of tendon jerk, either in the upper limb, biceps and triceps tendon jerks or deep reflexes. In the lower limb, either ankle or knee jerk. In the face, the jaw jerk, and so on, as you already studied in the section. The clinical significance of the tendon jerk, we can diagnose diseases. In case of absent jerk, absent reflex, areflexia or atonia, there is no tone, there is no reflex. When there is lesion affecting the reflex arc, the anterior horn cells, or the center, as in poliomyelitis. It's caused by viral infection, but now it's almost discarded. It's almost not present now because of the vaccination of poliomyelitis. But previously, poliomyelitis was spreading among children in the previous decades, leading to what we called absent tone and absent jerks, atonia and areflexia, because the tendon jerk and muscle tone are affected by the same way. When we exaggerate the stretch reflex, either tendon jerk or hypertonia, in three cases. In upper motor neuron lesion, as we mentioned before, in the case of decerebrate rigidity in the animal or internal capsule lesion, because we abolish the effect of inhibitory areas, so the stimulatory areas send and stimulate the stretch reflex, so the patient will be hypertonic and rigid or spastic, and at the same time there is exaggerated tendon jerk. In the case of hyperthyroidism, thyroid hormones increase the excitability of and increase the reflexes and decrease the reaction time of the reflexes, and nervousness or anxiety also increase the excitability and increase the tendon jerk and hypertonia, or increase the stretch reflex by two aspects, either static in the muscle tone or dynamic in the tendon jerk. What about weak jerk or hypotonia? Sometimes we call pendular, because the limb is go back and forward like the pendular action. Lesion in the supraspinal facilitatory areas. What are the supraspinal facilitatory areas? Like neurocerebellum. We mentioned it in the cerebellum, in the lecture of cerebellum in details. Lesion in the neurocerebellum, which is strong facilitatory area, when it's inhibited by the lesion, so the stretch reflex will be inhibited or will be weak, and the muscle tone will be decreased in hypotonia. At the same time, in myxedema, which is the contrary of the hyperthyroidism, it's hypothyroidism in adult, and sleep conditions, the muscle tone decrease. What is the clinical importance also of stretch reflex? What we call clonus. I think it's already explained to you and mentioned to you in the practical section, but it's a state of oscillation or oscillatory rhythmic contractions occurring of the muscle, as you see in the animated picture here. Oscillatory or rhythmic contraction occur in the muscle obtained by sudden and sustained stretch. Here the muscle is sustained, the tendon Achilles is suddenly sustained and maintained stretch of the muscle, leading to this oscillatory or rhythmic tendon jerk. It occurs either in the ankle or knee in particular. In case of hypertonia, in case of increased muscle tone, or when the stretch reflex is facilitated. Explain it by this mechanism. When sudden stretching occurring of the muscle, there is a stimulation of muscle spindle. Sudden stretching of the muscle, there will be stimulation of muscle spindle leading to muscle contraction, as we mentioned before. But at the same time, muscle contraction leads to muscle shortening. And muscle shortening, it is the case when the muscle spindle is inhibited and stretch reflex is stopping. So relaxation will occur. So when relaxation occurs with maintained stretch, the cycle repeats itself, because the muscle will be stretched again, and stretch reflex will be stimulated again, and the contraction. When contraction occurs, the stretch reflex will be inhibited, so relaxation, and so on and so on. The cycle is repeated: contraction followed by relaxation, contraction followed by relaxation, or alternating contraction and relaxation. Actually, another before we shifting to the functions of the stretch reflex, there is another mechanism that can explain the clonus, what we call the inverse stretch reflex. The inverse stretch reflex, we can explain it by what we call tendon, Golgi tendon organ. There is another receptor present in the tendon of the muscle called Golgi tendon organ. When sudden severe stretching occurs the muscle, as you can see in the animated picture in the previous slide, the tendon, Golgi tendon organ will be stimulated. So will send inhibitory fibers called 1B fibers, not 1A, 1B fibers, to inhibit the alpha motor neurons of the spinal cord. So the alpha motor fibers will be inhibited and the muscle will be relaxed. But with maintaining stretching, there will be another contraction followed by relaxation, another contraction followed by relaxation. So stretch reflex and inverse stretch reflex. Stretch reflex and inverse stretch reflex will leading to alternating contraction and relaxation of the muscle, or will lead to clonus, or this rhythmic oscillatory contraction that you see. Here we will end up by functions of stretch reflex. Number one, we said it before, to maintain the body posture against, especially in the anti-gravity muscle, against the effect of gravity. Number two is very important. It is the load reflex or servo assistant function. What is the servo assist function? The stretch reflex can fix various body of the parts in certain position. Let's imagine that you add a load on your hand here. So this muscle will be will be stretched, and when stretched, stretch reflex will be occurring, or will be happening, so that the stretch reflex can, when you add more loads, more stretching will occur, so can adding load contraction and elevating of loads, whatever the load is. So when you add loads here, the muscle will be stretched, but not more, but at the same time, this contraction is sufficient to elevate this load. When you add more and more load, the limb will maybe more fall down. But why cannot fall down here? Because the muscle stretching occur, so reflex contraction occur to the muscle due to muscle spindle restoring the arm position again. So the muscle and muscle spindle stretch as arm drops, so the arm will be elevated again. Okay, so when you add more loads, it's expected that the arm drops, but at the same time the muscle is stretched more than its length, so the stretch reflex will happening, leading to reflex contraction of the muscle and the elevation, so they can fix various parts of the body in position and resist any trial to change the position, which is the servo function, the position of the hand during threading a needle, and during lifting heavy weight with assist function. So we already explained the assist function here by adding more loads, but the servo function, what is the servo function? The servo function is that resisting any trial to change the position. How? By when you threading a needle, when you're trying to insert a thread into a needle, which one is responsible for maintaining your fingers and your hand and your arm in a fixed position to allow you to find this fine skilled movement by inserting the thread into the needle? Only the stretch reflex or the muscle contractions that occurs in stretch reflexes that can resist any try to change the position, and you can accomplish your task or your work by threading or inserting the thread into a needle. So that's called load reflex or servo assist function. How can we explain this mechanism? There is descending facilitation from the cortex to the alpha motor neuron to elevate this object or to elevate any load or to work or to active contraction of the muscle. When the muscle contracting, this is the force acquired to hold the load. Addition of more load will lead to more lengthening of the muscle, stretching of the muscle, that will lead to stimulation of the spindle receptor or muscle spindle, which is the stretch reflex receptor, that will be stimulated and sending to the alpha motor neuron to maintain the muscle contraction. So they serve to assist or to maintain the contraction of the muscle and prevent any any trial to drop the limb when we add more loads. Another mechanism to explain what is load reflex: increase gamma efferent discharge by stretching that occur in the muscle will stimulate the muscle spindle, as we mentioned before, leading to reflex contraction of the muscle and increase the sensitivity of the muscle spindle to resist the change of position, as we said during threading a needle. So we increase the discharge to alpha neurons, but reflexly by increasing the gamma efferent discharge, because when gamma efferent discharge increase, they leading to contractions of the peripheral contractile part, so the central part will be stretched and send along the primary and secondary endings to the alpha motor neuron to contract. So we increase the alpha discharge and maintain contraction of the muscle to lift the weight without more and more brain energy. So the brain or the cerebral cortex motor area doesn't need to send more impulses to stimulate the alpha motor neuron to contract the muscle or to give the order to the muscle to contract. Already alpha motor neurons are stimulated by the gamma efferent discharge that occur, and that helps the muscle to maintain contraction and compensate for any type of weakness or fatigue that will occur in the muscle. What is the other function of stretch reflex? Is the damping function. What is the damping function? The damping function that you have to know first that when the cortex sent to alpha motor neurons through the pyramidal tract, we will be explained in another lecture, to anterior horn cells or alpha motor neuron to contract a muscle actively, these impulses are irregular. But and in between there is gaps. Who can prevent this or fill these gaps, it is a stretch reflex. Through stimulation, through the gamma efferent discharge stimulation of alpha motor neurons, so they can fill the gap, or they can send impulses to stimulate the muscle contraction in between the impulses coming from the cortex, so they fill the gaps. Otherwise, if the muscle is dependent only on the cortical impulses, there will be irregular and tremors or jerky oscillatory movement, as you see. But it is not the case. In our case, the muscle can contract very smoothly. Why? Because the stretch reflex prevent this oscillation of the movements and make them smooth. Not oscillatory or jerky here, but smooth contraction, because it can fill the gap and maintain stimulation of alpha motor neurons despite the irregularity of impulses coming from the cerebral cortex. So what are the other functions of stretch reflex? As we see, the damping function, servo assistant function, and maintaining muscle tone. It helps to regulate the body temperature, because muscle contractions that occur in the muscle all the time, or muscle tone, can produce energy, can produce heat. So it is one of the thermoregulatory or temperature regulatory mechanisms that can allow the body to maintain its body temperature, especially in cold weather. Muscle tone also help venous and lymphatic return, mentioned before. Muscle tone also keep viscera in position, as we mentioned before.